Hi, Mezna. It's really great to be in conversation with you. We're recording this on June 5th, 2024, when the decimation of Gaza by Israel is still ongoing with over 36,000 Palestinians killed, and much of Gaza itself lays in ruin, which may make it somewhat strange to be speaking about archives at this particular moment. At least for me, this talk about archive and archiving Palestine and Palestinian people in some way allows us some way to think about talking about those lives that are lost, to tell their stories, to tell the places, the stories of the places themselves, and also maybe think about a future that is somewhat less violent. And I wanted to start off by asking you if you can basically tell us what is an archive and why it matters whether the Palestinian people, institution, or movements have one. And also, what does an archive of a liberation, of an anti-colonial movement looks like?
Hi, Shay. Thank you so much for the invitation to be in conversation with you. It's always a delight. And, and I think the question of archives is so crucial even now, because one form of elimination or one method of elimination is, of course, erasure, an erasure of histories and memories and lives. And those materials which allow us to tap into that history and memory and life. So it feels always urgent to think about archives, even in this moment of horrific violence. So let me start off actually with a very kind of humdrum, but very standard definition by the International Council of Archives on what an archive is. So this is a quote. Archives are the documentary byproduct of human activity retained for their long-term value. The records created in the course of the everyday lives and actions of individuals and organizations offer direct insights into past events. Like people, archives are diverse. They come in a variety of formats, including text, photographs, video, sound, analog, and digital. Archives are held by individuals and institutions around the world, with the buildings housing them often sharing the name of archives. So this is a very kind of standard definition, and it is, to a large degree, helpful even in thinking about Palestinian archives and what is a Palestinian archive. Perhaps, although with a couple of key differences. One, often for Palestinians, this question of the archive sits in tandem with the question of what is a Palestinian, and therefore what is a Palestinian archive. And for that, I think that we always have to make a distinction between archives in Palestine or Palestine archives and Palestinian archives. Archives in Palestine can include any set of collections of materials and records across Mandate Palestine, or historic Palestine, that house materials pertaining to the history of that geography, the history of the institutions in that geography, religious, governmental, state, educational, etc., municipal, for example, and collections of the Palestinian people, which in a sense reflect the condition of the Palestinian people: dispersed, dispossessed, largely not in institutions or buildings called archives, largely in collections in private hands, in family papers, in leather satchels under mattresses, in cupboards, in cellars, in attics, and really scattered but very much cared for as a kind of caretaking, the caretaking of these collections, of these images, of these photographs, of these books, of these documents is a way of trying to caretake one's sense of oneself as Palestinian, and a way of claiming and maintaining a relationship to Palestine, no matter where a person is. So you see Palestinian collections all over the world, really, across the Arab world, in refugee camps and in towns in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, in Egypt, in the Gulf, across into the Maghreb and Tunisia in particular, in Algeria as well. The PLO Research Center collections are in part in Algeria. The Palestine Liberation Army's collections are in Cairo, for example, but also in the United States, amongst Palestinian communities in the US, in Chicago, in New Jersey, in Oakland, and as far-flung as where, the largest Latin American population of Palestinians in Chile has an incredible over century-old history with its own collections at the University of Santiago, in Club Palestina, in all sorts of community formations and organizations in the country, as well as across Latin America. And then as far-flung as China and the mercantile records of Palestinian merchants, particularly in southern China. These collections are often registered as Palestinian insofar as they tell a tale, and they provide a way in which to think about the story of Palestinians in those places. And they are often, they feature a history of Palestinians navigating their life, not just after the Nakba in 1948, but before it as well. Histories of Palestinian community work, for example, in New York, is featured in the collections of the New York Public Library, or in Detroit, in Dearborn in particular. So these collections, this is what it means to think about the Palestinian archive, that it is an archive of a stateless people, a people who scattered, and also a people who are very much concerned with thinking about themselves still as a Palestinian people with an archive or collections of archives, or many archives, that can be mobilized to tell their story and also to understand their past, to do and draw from these collections to make new kind of historical analyses and think about, in this kind of cataclysmic century of Palestinian life, what has changed, how has it changed, but also what has stayed very much the same or has been continuous. What dynamics, social, political, economic, and otherwise, class, gender, race, religion, have not changed or have. So, yeah, and to your question around what makes it an anti-colonial archive, what is the relationship between these collections and anti-colonial struggles? Certainly, that first is to understand who it is that seeks to be free, but also this transnational feature of the Palestinian archive is also a feature that informs Palestinian archives of solidarity and the archives and collections of all the people all over the world who have sought to relate in commitment and in struggle with the Palestinian cause. And so these collections in particular have been incredibly informative for thinking about both the shape and nature of the Palestinian struggle, but also the way that the Palestinian struggle encountered and interacted with other struggles, unions, other liberation movements, other political parties, etc. Both in Europe and the West, but also in China and Vietnam, in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, in Southern Africa, and Latin America and elsewhere. It also is a way and an opportunity for thinking about a Palestinian archive that is about collections of oral histories, wherein these kinds of oral histories that allow Palestinians to speak in a vacuum of their denial of voice, and their denial, or the impermissibility of them to narrate their own lives and their own histories. So oral history collections become a crucial Palestinian archive, particularly in the last 75 years. Yeah. So, I mean, and that actually gets me to think about your own work and what you've been thinking about in terms of the Palestinian archive and the most expansive Palestinian archive, or Palestine archive, which is the one in Israel. And so maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what that looks like and its features.
Yeah, thanks. I'm a historian of social and cultural history, and when I started off writing on 1948, I was really interested in looking for these personal letters of Palestinians, in addition to those of Jews that I work on during my study. And I started looking for them, and initially, people had told me that such sources, they do not exist, right? I was looking for letters from 1947 to 1949 and later. And I refuse to believe that. We know the literacy rate. We know that Palestinians were and still are among the most educated populations in the Arab world. And I was starting to look for these sources initially in the Israeli archives, because of this assumption that the erasure of Arab Palestine in 1948 also meant the appropriation of its cultural heritage. And I was really shocked of what I found. I mean, it is this important and immensely rich subset of the Palestinian archives that have been embedded into the Israeli archive, right? Tens of thousands of documents in Arabic, right? Of institutions, from obviously the Arab Higher Committee, but from orphanages and from these massive book collections that we know have been looted and embedded into the library of the Hebrew University and later the National Library of Israel. So massive collections. And they're not just from 48. So the first massive looting takes place in 1948, but there's an additional massive confiscation and looting of documents in 1956 in Gaza during the short-lived occupation of that region during the Suez War. And then again in 1967, right, with the permanent occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And then again in 1982 with Israel invasion into Lebanon and the takeover of the Palestine, the PLO Research Center, right? And so these documents are all in the Israeli archive. And I think we really are only scratching the surface of being able to first understand the magnitude of the cultural appropriation that is taking place. Only obviously a little bit of that is available. And I'll just give you some just small examples, right? So in 1949, the sort of Palestinian government in exile declares the establishment of something called the Old Palestine government. They call it Umum Palestine, or Hukumat Umum Palestine. It's based out of Gaza. And it manufactures and writes all these plans about how this Palestinian state would look like. All that documentation, I was able to find out, is also been taken over and looted by Israel and exists in its archive. So the first, so to speak, plans for a Palestinian state are also in the Israeli archive. But what makes things, of course, even more frustrating is that Israel's claim that because of reasons of national security, it cannot reveal those documents, right, written in Arabic by Palestinian statesmen and officials and others for their plan for a Palestinian state in 1949. But that's just sort of one example. In 1956, as I mentioned, during Israel's short-lived occupation of Gaza, it takes over massive private collection and printing presses and others in the Gaza Strip. I was really fortunate to be able to examine just one tiny, tiny, tiny collection that was looted in 1956. And I found there this personal archive of this one Palestinian man, that basically we don't know much about. His name is Wadia Iskandar Azam. And I'm not sure how his personal archive was looted and transferred over Israel, but just looking at it very, very briefly about a year ago, I saw the land deeds for his lands in Safed, right? The Kushan, the Ottoman documents, his marriage certificate, the business cards of all the people he interacted throughout his life, right? A personal diary he wrote, and even poems, right? So all these sort of entire world of individuals, right? Not the Amin al-Husseinis and others of the world, but of ordinary people that is also in those archives. And I mentioned that we're just scratching the surface because it assumed that much of the Palestinian archive subset inside Israel is actually in the archives of the Israel Secret Service, the Shin Bet, which are completely closed off to scholars, and none of their material, almost none, has been declassified or made available. And it's assumed that much, much, much is still embedded there. So it's really this huge, huge, huge collection. And I think we haven't really looked at almost any of it at this point.
So I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm wondering, how does one get in? How do you get into the archive?
Yeah, well, the question of access is really, of course, is an important one. And obviously, I'm very privileged in that sense, being an Israeli Jewish person who can go to these archives, because many are barred from entering the state, even on political grounds, and others that may not be able to look at these archives, that of the Israel State Archive, of the archives of the Israel Defense Forces. In recent years, some of those materials were declassified and put online. And so that actually, the massive digitization project has serious issues and problems, but it also, to a degree, democratizes the ability to look at those materials, even if you're not privileged to be able to go there, right? Because of the class or nationality and other things. And so some of that material is now available online and can be accessed, but much of it is not, right? So basically, the state have used two major justifications to try and block access to these files. One is a very cynical one, is the claim that it will infringe on the privacy of the Palestinians whose documents and records are kept in those archives. And I don't think we even need to explain why this is a very, very, very cynical use of that argument. And the other one is that exposing those sources or revealing them or declassifying them will harm Israel's national security. And for many, many years, I've petitioned to get all sorts of specific files, even going as far as the Israeli Supreme Court. And sadly, those kind of justifications were held by the court, right? So I'll give you just one example that's just truly shocking to me, right? Israel, as I'm sure you're well aware, has made it a staple of its propaganda to expose and talk about the relationship of Amin al-Husseini and Nazi Germany during World War II, right? Exposed and released all the documents from those years. However, it turns out that Israel has also the personal archive of Amin al-Husseini from the war years itself, 1947 to 1949. All the original Arabic documents also are in the Israeli archive. But that material, Israel refuses to release and declassify, claiming it will significantly harm its national security. So we see that even in the declassification of documents, Israel very strategically tries to basically bolster its own sort of propaganda initiative, its own narrative, also through declassification. Now, I want to give a caveat here. Israel had made its, makes its claims, right, to be a liberal democracy. We know to not to trust these claims, but as long as it is important for the state to make these claims, even as just as a pretext, it will not be able to sanitize Arab Palestine from its archive. So even with all these restrictions that we talked about, and we continue to talk, and they're most immensely important, there is still an ocean of material, right? Unbelievable material that needs to be, excavated and can be explored and written with, either by scholars or by individuals. A lot of it is already made available online and is literally waiting to be used. And so that's something to really, really think about. Now, I wanted to ask you, now we're in this unbelievable apocalypse, right? With carnage and destruction. How does that specifically inform your thinking on, the Palestine archive and archives more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for thinking with me about access there. And really it is, access becomes, so a couple of things immediately come to mind, which is the history of Gaza as written or as possible through now the Israeli collections, or not the Israeli collections, but the collections in Israeli hands. And what we then start thinking about in terms of that, when we think about a history, new histories of Gaza. The other is to think, so I think about it, on one hand, to remember that the archives, that Gaza did have enormous collections of archival material that was caretaken by whole cohorts of archivists, some of who have been murdered, and some material of which was not digitized and is irreplaceable. The Kehran collection, for example, of the Kehran studio is gone. Entire collections of ministries, of education, of culture, of antiquities, of Islamic endowments or the Awqaf, all of that was destroyed. And that means, and that is what war does, it destroys capacity for memory work in that precisely that way. It is on purpose. So there is sometimes this impulse to say, and perhaps this is me being a little bit more traditionalist as a historian, that memory will compensate. I'm not so sure. Memory can compensate. And I think it does. It gives a pass to the violence of war and the sort of the eliminationist impulse that is embedded within this violence. Yeah. When we say that memory can compensate. There are entire family histories that will be enormously now difficult to retrieve. I'm thinking about all of those scholars after the Nakba who dedicated themselves to village histories which became the bedrock of Palestinian historiography, particularly Palestinian historiography after the Nakba, which is a much, you and I talk about and lament the much smaller cohort of us that work on the history of Palestinians after the Nakba, right? Versus those scholars who work on the history of Palestine before the Nakba. But it's because of this question of archives and elimination and what happens when you have to think about archives that are now under siege or under lock and key, have been destroyed, have been scattered, disaggregated. Sometimes, and in some ways, the archive reflects the condition of Palestinians. So the genocide or that we're seeing now in Gaza will be reflected in the condition of the materials themselves. But it means too that certain things become more urgent. And one of them is, of course, retrieval of what is left, the remnants from the ruination. It is to think of new conceptual models about how we retrieve histories. But it's also thinking very clearly about the necessary subterfuge or the necessary ways that some scholars in Israel who are oppositional, who are kindred spirits, must become allies in this struggle.
I wonder if this time is also a time to really try and at least partially reverse this, right, stolen cultural heritage, right, that is really of unbelievable magnitude and was never brought to, international legal forums, etc. Right? I mean, it's really interesting because we have so many precedents in Jewish history where archives of Jewish communities around the world were either stolen or kept by countries of which Jews were exterminated or expelled, etc. And how much of a sort of a world uproar has there been, right, in Congress and in Jewish American organizations and elsewhere for the safe return of those archives to their rightful owners. And we have this unbelievable cultural heritage that is of a different people, right? So even if you try to, not that it's possible to separate it from the current moment, maybe the time we're in now can maybe give some opening for that demand. Maybe I'm being too
1%, so one of the most important things, I think, a grouping that I'm very proud to be part of, Librarians and Archivists with Palestine, was to develop a mechanism for continuous reporting on the destruction of archival materials and destruction and looting of archival collections in Gaza, precisely because someone, somewhere, we have to keep a record of what was destroyed, but also what may have been taken, and where has it gone. And this is, something that Palestinians, don't need to, can draw from their own past, but also from the very immediate past of Iraq and the collections that were looted out of Iraq and elsewhere in the region. It's also important because, what is regarded as an archive needs to expand now in order for it to be included in any demands of return. This includes the governmental archives of the ministries in Gaza. Those are collections. Those are archival collections that are, in their fact, actually quite crucial because civil registries, health documents, educational materials, all of that needs to go back, needs to be retrieved, not only for historical purposes for us nerds who are going to want to look at them, but also for the people of Gaza themselves, the Palestinians in Gaza themselves, and retrieval of their own documents and documentation and their own past and histories of those, family members who have been killed and ancestors and descendants thinking about their ancestors in the future. So this, one of the problems is in fact within the Palestinian struggle, this demand for the retrieval of records has been rather minimal, and it certainly has never been a core part of Palestinian demands in the ways that it should. And that needs to change too. This is also a political process, and the Palestinian people as a whole need to mobilize around a sense of urgency to its collections, and particularly its collections in Gaza, and demands for their repatriation. In whatever form the Palestinians decide that repatriation to be. It's not the business of Israel or any state to determine how Palestinians think and deliberate about that, which is often the sticking point for international institutions.
right.
It's not like Israel doesn't have the British Museum and any other international institution and archive to draw from as a precedent for what it's doing. Looting is a global project. Yeah. So yeah, it feels very urgent to think about these things now. And you know, I very much think that some of these questions, particularly around retrieval and recovery, have expiration dates. Sometimes these early periods of war are periods when more can be done more quickly than when things end up under lock and key and are even harder to track and trace, or they enter, you know, the black market. I guarantee you, in a couple of months, we will start seeing even more material from Gaza on eBay. And then when that happens, when you enter a black market of artifacts and materials, then it's a very different and a much harder battle.
Let's one last question I wanted to ask you, and you know, to think of maybe a slightly more optimistic future. You know, we're both historians. Let's, for the sake of our discussion, pretend that there is a Palestine archive, or that what is we know exists is become easier to access, and you know, scholars and ordinary people can access that. What would you like to see that is done with that, right? Because the archives are the first step, right? And so, what in your sort of hopeful thinking would people be able to do with that material?
Well, I have some dreams about what I hope future historians would do with that material, which is to write richer stories of Palestinian life that would talk about difference as much as sameness, and would think about different ways Palestinians understood themselves in the world, understood themselves in relation to each other. I would love more histories that think about the interiority of Palestinian life more generally. But also, I would love for them to use these collections, to play with them, to enjoy them, to create art with them, to be in conversation with them, to take objects and artifacts and archival materials, letters and poems and registration documents and health records, and to think about them and to see in them a kind of a course and pulse of a people that tried to make it. Who knows what the Palestinian people will look like in 5 years, 10 years, 100 years. But certainly there's a story there about, you know, keeping up the fight. And I hope that they draw inspiration from that and a sense of optimism, even in the most desperate of times. And that is also why so much social material needs to be retrieved, because it is in those worlds that people create in community with each other that kind of hopefulness is sustained and built and cared for and advanced.
Thank you so much, Mezna. It's been a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much.